Most of you have heard about rapture theology, you've heard about that kind of stuff. I'm going to say more about that because a lot of really, really good scholars are saying that's been completely misunderstood and misinterpreted. And I'll let you know what they think all of that really is. And it's even weirder than what they say on television. Yes, Joe?
What was the term you just used?
The rapture theology.
Oh, rapture.
You've heard about that stuff?
Yeah. Yes.
Presbyterians generally do not emphasize that stuff. But, hey, Linda, did you get a piece of paper there? Nope. Somebody grab Linda a piece of paper. Good. All right, if you'll everybody have your seats, and I'm going to pray, and then we're going to get started because it's about 25 after or so. Alrighty. Here comes Cinda. Hey, Cindy, you can just leave that open because, or not. That door makes so much noise. Yeah. The easiest way is to come around the back. All right, well then let's pray. Gracious God, now we pause for a minute to look into the scriptures together and perhaps to learn new things or learn old things differently. But may your Spirit come and be our primary teacher. And may we depart more hungry for a living word and to know the truth and the way that came before us. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. So I'm going to start with a 4-word sentence that starts this book. Paul never met who? Jesus. You guys are getting better and better. I appreciate that. Paul never met the man, the earthly man, Jesus. Did he know about him? Probably. Probably. Not everybody did in Judaism in that day. But did he meet him? Did he argue with him? No, he did not. And there's a lot of really good scholars these days that says the fact that that was the case has great implications, has had great implications for the church. Because there was a Jewish Christianity. There was a way of being the body of Christ, followers of Jesus, that was present long before Paul really cranked up his ministry. And what I want to share with you was how different the two really were. Okay? All right. So, how do we know about Paul? What is our exposure to Paul? 3 sources, really, right? His letters in the New Testament. We'll talk about which ones the scholars believe were actually his, and those that are attributed to him were probably from his students who used his name. How else do we know about this man named Paul in the New Testament? What other book? The book of Acts. The book of Acts. The book of Acts, said to have been written by Luke the physician, who also wrote the gospel. So Luke's gospel, Acts are a 2-volume series, okay? When were Paul's letters written? What do you think? Guess. What years? 50 to 60? 50 to 60 AD, somewhere in there. Yeah, more or less. When was the book of Acts written? At least 40, 50, some even think 60, 70 years later. Okay? Which means what? That if you really want to know what Paul thought, what he did, you got to look at what? Acts or his letters?
His letters.
Exactly. And you get different images of who this guy was. Okay? There's implications and there's different understandings. Luke softens Paul's edges a lot. Okay? A lot. All right. always remember the time frame. Okay, so Jesus was crucified about what year? 30 or so AD, right in there. When did Paul have his big Damascus Road experience? How many years later do you think? Remember what happened to him on the road to Damascus? He was riding up to Damascus and he had this incredible, bizarre, mystical experience. How many years after did that happen, do you think? Any guess? A little less than 10. Think about 7. About 37 AD.
Oh, wow.
So 7 or 8 years passed between Jesus' ministry, his execution in Jerusalem, and when Paul first, well, I guess his toes were dipped for him in the waters of Christianity. Remember, it came on him. He didn't invite it. It happened to him. So keep that in mind, all right? Also keep in mind this. In the year 70 AD, so about 40 years after the time of Jesus, what was the big event that happened in Jerusalem? The big event. 70 AD. What happened? The destruction of the temple, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem by the Romans. They finally had all they could take of the rebellion of the Jewish people, because the Romans were their oppressors and they had taken over the country, and all these little pop-up insurrections and stuff kept happening, and they would kill a bunch of people, and then everything would die down for a while, then it would start again. So finally in 70 AD, they had enough, and the emperor sent in thousands of soldiers, and they destroyed the Jerusalem temple, and they destroyed the city. Not completely, but they really messed the place up. Before that happened, though, it is said that a lot of the Christian believers, the Jewish Christians, the followers of Jesus who lived there, they remembered that Jesus said, it actually followed the reading we had today from Mark's Gospel, where the apostles are going, where the disciples are saying, oh my, look at all this big temple, this big beautiful temple, and these huge stones, remember? Because they were country bumpkins, and they were there just looking, because the temple was probably the greatest edifice in the city. And they were just awed by it. And what did Jesus say to them? It's all going to come tumbling down. Not one stone will be left on the other. And they knew it. And other people who read the writing on the walls, as those years progressed, as there was more and more Jewish pushback against the Romans, they sort of knew we're headed for a terrible cataclysm. So a lot of the Christian believers fled Jerusalem. And we think we know where they went. They went to this, many of them went to this valley and hid there, this valley outside, way outside the city up near Syria. But a lot of them just went to other places. They just went north, up into Asia Minor. And guess who had already been there? Paul. Paul had already been there. So all these Jewish Christians, who very likely were still going to synagogue for a while, having a kosher kitchen, the whole thing, they were there doing their thing, and Paul is out doing his thing. And that's what I want to talk with you about today. All right? So we know that Paul made it to Jerusalem after his conversion experience 3 times. Now, why would Paul have made a point to go to Jerusalem? This is before the destruction of Jerusalem and all that. This is after Jesus' crucifixion. Exactly.
To engage with Peter.
To engage with Peter and James. And remember this, we now have absolute proof, there is no doubt about it, that Peter was not the head of the church. All that is not true. James, the brother of Jesus, became the head of the Jesus movement, which was headquartered in Jerusalem. Okay? James was. In 64 AD, James was martyred right about the time Paul was. And we'll get to that. But the point is that James and who else? Who were the 3 main leaders of the church? Number 1 was James, who was not an apostle, by the way. No. Peter and John. But Peter was not the leader. James, all the church fathers say, James, the brother of Jesus, was the leader, the bishop of Jerusalem. He led the church. Not the church, but don't think of it like our church. Think of it like a movement, a sect within Jerusalem, or within Judaism. James led it. Peter did not. Peter was a high-ranking person. He was an apostle. But James was the head pastor. No doubt about it. Okay? And there was Peter and John. And the reason that Paul went to Jerusalem is because the headquarters, James and the apostles, had heard about this guy named Paul, who was out up in Asia Minor, in what's in Turkey, and in Greece, preaching about Jesus. And they also heard that he was preaching strange things. That Paul was or had been a devout Pharisaic Jew. And they heard rumors that sounded like Paul was abandoning his Judaism. That he was forgetting the Torah and the law and the kosher laws and all that sort of stuff. And they got word to him and said, you get your rear end down here. We run this. You need to come and tell us what you're preaching. And this is in the book of Acts, but it's also recorded in Paul's letters, where he went. He said, I met with, the first time, just Peter and James. And it was sort of quiet. And he met with them sort of like, make sure you're staying within the lines, You're a Jew. We are Jews. Jesus was a Jew. Yeah. You obey the law. You keep the law. And he said, oh, absolutely. Yeah, sure enough. What Paul, we know, was teaching was what he would call the law of Christ. Not the law of Moses, but the law of Christ. Okay? And I'll get to more of that in a second. And then 10 years later, he goes back. He's called back. This time, he's called in front of everybody. James and all the apostles who were still living. I don't know if all of them were, but the ones that were there. And they had that first church council. Remember what was decided at the first big council of the church in 50 AD? Remember, people, this is 20 years after the time of Christ. It's in the book of Acts, chapter 15. What was the issue? All these Gentile Christians, that Paul and others are bringing in, but especially this dude Paul, because he called himself the apostle to the Gentiles. We got to know. So do they have to become Jews, even though they may not be ethnic Jews? Maybe they're Greeks or whatever. So, number one, do the males have to be circumcised? And do they have to keep a kosher kitchen? Do they have to follow all those food and dietary laws that Moses laid out that all of us do? Do they have to do it? And who handed down the verdict? James. It says James made the decision. He heard arguments about it, and Paul spoke, and James said, no, they don't have to be circumcised, but they have to abstain from fornication, from sexual immorality, and they can't eat meat that's sacrificed to idols and blood, which is, the Jews didn't either. But they could eat other things. But you couldn't eat any meat that had been sacrificed to an idol, to a heathen idol with blood in it and all that kind of stuff. You couldn't do that. Other than that, there you go. It's interesting to me that, I've always wondered, so were they also keeping the Sabbath? That came later. What day is the day of rest for Jews and Christians and all that? But that's in Acts 15. Yes, Jane?
In all the time that Jesus was alive, and there were the disciples and everything, we never heard anything about James.
No. In fact, we don't think he really believed that his brother was a Messiah until either late in his life, his ministry, or afterwards. But they all say, when it was all said and done, there are some other gospels that are not in our scriptures that where Jesus says he's going to leave his ministry to James, the just one, the good one, his brother. Sort of like a dynasty kind of thing. All right? But yeah, it's interesting. And so we just think, well, did he leave the keys to Peter? That's what some churches teach, right? It's not what it meant, and it's not what happened. The reality is James led the church. Peter and John helped him. But James was the bishop.
It always seems like you never heard anything about
No.
James.
And because it's all buried away, and these scholars are like, you guys, you need to wake up and smell the coffee. But think about it. And James led the church for how many years? Or not the church, but more the movement. The movement within Judaism until his execution in the year 64 AD. So for 34 years, James was the head. He was the bishop. He was the head presbyter.
And then how is
The scholars say the next brother of Jesus, whose name Simon, I think his name was, or Simeon. Simeon, I can't remember now, but they think the next brother led it. But again, at that point, the church had dispersed and had left Jerusalem.
why is he executed, James?
That's a very interesting story because he was beloved by Christians and Jews. James was known to be a very good man. A lot of people respected him and listened to him. And my understanding is that between the emperors, and was it Nero and the other guy, I can't remember. Or maybe it wasn't the emperors, it was a governor. Whoever was governing that area. There was this period before one died and one showed up. And the head priest, I think his name was, he was the son of Caiaphas. Remember Caiaphas the priest who had Jesus? His son, whose name escapes me, he decided this would be a really good time to off this guy because he's a pain in my rear end. And you know how they did it? It's a horrible story. They took him up to the pinnacle of the temple, the highest point in Jerusalem, which I think is on the southeast corner of the old mount, and they threw him off, which was a form of execution in those days. They did that a lot. The sad thing is that they said he survived the fall, and they finished him off with rocks. And it so angered everybody knew that he was a follower of Jesus, that he was the Lord's brother. It so angered the city that they protested to the emperor, and guess what? The emperor chucked the new governor, whose name I can't remember. He just said, "You're done. You've already made such a mess of this. This is or no, not the emperor, the high priest." He switched out because they could name the high priest, which is kind of weird. It was more a political office. And so this son of Caiaphas who had this done, he didn't do it after that. He was done with his job, and they got a new high priest. He so angered everybody that even the new Roman prefect said, "You got to go. You've caused such unrest by killing this man that everybody loved." But the whole place was on fire because just 6 years later, the Romans, everybody was fighting in it, a lot of insurrection, and the Romans came in and just wiped it out. So the Christians are looking at all this and they're like, they killed James. We better get out of here. We better split. This is getting bad. So a lot of them left and just kind of went north and got out of the city. All right. And then on my little cheat sheet, you can see that 6 years later, about 56 AD, Paul was arrested and taken to Rome. He was a Roman citizen. He was a Pharisaic Jew, but he was also a Roman citizen. And so he was arrested. We think, again, because he wasn't a part of the imperial cult. He spoke against Caesar as being Lord. He ticked some people off. You know, Paul had a real edgy. You probably wouldn't like Paul. My guess would be. He ticked a lot of people off, and he was arrested. He was a troublemaker. And they arrested him, they sent him to Rome. But once he got there, he lived under house arrest. He was free to do his thing, but he had to stay there. And the story, we don't know for sure, but the story is that Paul himself, was executed in Rome just about 64, just about the same time that James was executed in Jerusalem.
Wasn't Peter executed about then too?
About the same time. Now, and I want to read something to you. I got to put my glasses on. This is sort of the picture that all of us get from Sunday school, growing up in church. Let's see, where did I say it? It was page 4. This is the story. Okay, listen to this. The standard Sunday school or catechetical view of Christian origins goes something like this. Jesus came to preach a new covenant gospel that superseded the Jewish understanding of God and his plan for the salvation of humankind. So, from the law of Moses, to what Paul called the law of Christ, or grace, right? Jesus passed on the fundamentals of this new message to his chosen 12 apostles, who came to understand its full implications only after his death. Okay? Because a lot of the stuff Paul talks about, Jesus did not. And that's just the plain hard truth. Paul, who at first bitterly opposed the newly formed Christian church, arresting Christians to be delivered up for execution, became the 13th apostle. Now again, this is the story almost everyone in this room heard. Became the 13th apostle. Last but not least, chosen directly by Jesus Christ through the vision, right? Who had ascended to heaven. Paul's mission, this is what he said, my mission was to preach the gospel message of salvation to the non-Jewish or Gentile world, while Peter, leader of the 12 apostles, and again, that's the story, that Peter led the 12 apostles, led the mission to the Jews from Jerusalem. Both Jew and Gentile were united in the one Christian church with one single unified gospel message. According to this mythology, despite a few initial issues that had to be worked out, like circumcision and kosher laws and Sabbath issues, Peter and Paul worked in support of harmony. They were together in life and in death, because that's one of the myths, is that they were executed together in Rome. Probably not true. And they laid the foundation for a universal Christian faith that has continued through the centuries. Historians of early Christianity question such a harmonizing view, linking Jesus, the first apostles, and Paul. It serves theological dogma more than historical truth. And that's what we're going to look at. Okay? So that's what we all heard. That they were just pals, and one went to the Jews and one went to the Gentiles. And what you're going to see from Paul's letters is that is not the case. That Paul did not think highly at all of the apostles. And he says, I don't care what they say about, the so-called leaders. It means nothing to me. Why? Because they opposed some of his teaching. They opposed some of his teaching. All right? Yes?
Which of the two of them accepted the women as apostles? Like Junia?
I would guess Paul,
Okay.
because the originals. Now remember what the criteria was. If you look at the first or second chapter of Acts, the criteria to become an apostle. Because remember, Judas was an apostle. He died. They had to replace him. And the criteria was they had to have known Jesus and followed him. They had to be good men. Sorry, ladies, no women at that point. They had to be a really, really good man. They had to be a follower of Jesus. And two people came to the fore, right? And they didn't know which one to pick. One was Matthias and one was, I can't remember. There were two. And guess how they made the decision?
Casting lots.
They cast lots.
Gambling, that's good.
Well, it was not gambling as much as it was divination. It was divination. It was absolutely divination. They cast lots, and I think Matthias got it. He was the 12th. Paul's not in there at all. Why? Because Paul didn't know Jesus. Paul didn't follow Jesus. So there's these 12 apostles doing their things in Jerusalem, led by James, the brother of Jesus. And then Paul comes along 7 years later, has this incredible experience. Now, and guess, it was Jews who took him on to Damascus and took care of him, right? Because he was blinded. He was temporarily blinded.
Was it Ananias?
Ananias.
Ananias.
You've got a good memory, Marianne. Ananias. They took him in. They told him more, because he experienced Jesus like in this weird mystical vision experience. And then Ananias preached to him. He was converted. He was baptized. And then it says he went off to Arabia. He went off somewhere to learn, to grow, to study. Some scholars think that while he was in Arabia, whatever Arabia was, it probably wasn't down in that desert. It was probably over in Syria, somewhere in there. That he had his own mountaintop experience like Moses. In fact, people assume that Paul only had one visionary experience on the road to Damascus. He had several. He was a mystical person. It happened to him several times. And it was during those mystical experiences where he said, I have seen the Lord. You guys say I haven't. You guys say I have never met Jesus, but I have. But I'm one up on you. You knew the man Jesus. I know the risen Christ. And he spoke directly to me. I received direct information and revelation from him. And he says that in his letter to the Galatians, I believe.
Do you think that was really true? In the vision, do you think he really did have that experience?
I do think Paul did have. There are people who have. They're just prone to those mystical things. But I also know that people can. It's sometimes how you interpret them and whatever. But do I believe he had them? Yeah. Because I don't think a Pharisaic Jew, who was as nasty as he was to Christian believers, would just do something like that for the heck of it. To me, it would have taken an absolutely bizarre, mystical experience to completely upend his life. Remember, he was an educated Jew from Tarsus, one of the greatest universities there. He was an educated person. He knew philosophy. He could argue with the philosophers. He was a Roman citizen, which means he came from probably a very well-to-do family.
But didn't he say he saw Christ? He was in
Yeah.
prison at one of the...
Yeah. Over and over and over again, yeah.
Yeah, but it was later. He said Christ talked to him periodically.
Oh, yeah. So he's, so that's how he's... And here's something else, you guys. Do you know that verse that a lot of people read in communion? For I say to you, as it was given unto me, the blah, 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 blah. You know where Paul got that? You know where Paul got his image of what happened at the Last Supper? Through a vision. He says, I received this directly from Jesus. He told me. Those words in, I think it's 1 Corinthians. I hand on to you what was handed on to me from Jesus. First-hand account.
He had to have been a very charismatic person.
Yes, he was. He absolutely was. So
We don't have very many mystics among us as Protestants, so we're not used to that.
we are not. But boy, we love Paul.
How did he
We
stay
love
alive?
Paul. What's that?
How did he stay alive and not get executed?
They tried to kill him a lot of times. He always survived. He was stoned. He would tick people off wherever he went. He was fearless.
Wasn't he kicked out of several cities?
Yeah.
He left it.
Yeah. And sometimes the other Christians said, "You better get out of here. You're causing too much trouble. Just get out of
Just
here.
like melt into the crowd.
Just go home. Just go." Yeah. Remember they let him down out of a basket? And the crowds were going to come in to get him, and they let him down in a basket and told him, "Get the heck out of here. Just please go away." And he did. He softened as he grew older. Jim.
Did they
Exactly.
know how
Don't
many
be
years
excited.
Paul was with the Pharisees before he changed?
No. I don't know how all that worked, Jim. Jim says, how long was Paul a Pharisee? Remember, Pharisees, there were many sects, SCT of Judaism. Pharisees were one of them. I would guess from a young adult, you know,
They tell you his professor, his teacher was,
Gamaliel.
yeah.
Gamaliel, yeah,
He
very
was
learned
raised,
guy.
you know.
Very learned guy. But he was definitely, and he says, you know, I was a Jew among Jews. I was the Jew of Jews. I kept the law. I was a Pharisee, which means I kept the letter of the law. It was very important to me. And he was so fervent in a bad way that he took it upon him to wipe out this Jesus movement in Judaism. Remember that? So he was a very, very religious person, a very observant person, but he was willing to use malevolent means to tamp down this. And actually, Jesus, it was the latest messianic movement. There had been others. Jesus was the latest. But his was coming by storm because people said Jesus actually healed people and did incredible things. And that, people saw him after his death. And so Paul was like, we need to wipe this out before it spreads. And Paul was doing that. And he was on the road to go to Damascus to round up Christian believers, Jesus believers up there when this thing happened, 7 years after the crucifixion. So you get a picture of this guy. And he pretty much says, I was really, man, I was messed up. Well, he was on fire for Pharisaic Judaism and willing to do whatever it took, even if it was unkind, cruel, even evil, malevolent. He was doing it to promote what he thought was the purity of the faith.
How would that compare or contrast to the zealots?
Well, the zealots were out and out spear chuckers. The zealots were the people with the guns and the spears and stuff behind the scenes.
But Simon,
Paul had the authority. And again, here's another question: how did Paul get the authority to go do this? The zealots were against the Romans. The zealots were against the Roman occupation.
okay, there's your answer.
Paul had official authority from the temple authorities. Somebody gave him the power to do this because he probably had soldiers that would go with him
To arrest them.
from the temple like temple police to go do it. He got the authority somehow. He was known. So he was a person of some repute. Okay? Good questions. So the point we're going to make is that we've been reading Paul, we read his letters through that story that we think that everything was chummy and great. Peter and Paul did this and they worked together and they even died together and it was just all great. It wasn't. There was a real power struggle between Paul and his gospel. And he called it my gospel, by the way. My gospel. The one I preach, not what they're preaching down in Jerusalem. And I'll show you that next week. And then also by the end of our time together next Sunday, I want to give you 7 or 8 points that they're not mine, they're from another scholar, that says this is really what Paul believed. And one of the big things Paul believed is that the end was near. That Jesus had been raised into a glorified spiritual being, that he was going to come back and he was going to run the world. Not just the Roman Empire, but the entire world. He would run the place. And Paul believed early on that it would happen within his lifetime. Later, in some of his later letters, you can see he's like, well, hasn't happened yet. It's going to, so don't give up. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. But that's where a lot of our end times, the rapture people, the end times theology comes out of what many scholars believe is a misinterpretation of, I think it's Thessalonians.
But maybe it was
preachers
Paul
among us.
misinterpreted, not people misinterpreting Paul.
Paul believed what he believed, but the misinterpretation is not understanding what Paul really believed, which is way weirder than what we imagine.
But isn't a lot of this when we look at all the evil in the world. And end time is wishful thinking when everything will be made just
Right.
and right.
And they all want
we have
that.
that today. I mean, you had people that would like,
Right.
Oh, by Tuesday.
Yeah.
no, but there
They've always been the people, and you know, in the last, I don't know, guys, what's it been, last 150 years, there's been a resurgence. You know, every time you approach a millennium, there's been a resurgence that, oh, the end is coming, the end of the world, blah, 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 blah. And then I don't know, late 1800s, early 1900s, this whole rapture theology. Rapture's not even in the Bible. Not the word, anyway.
Wasn't it called
It's-
great disappointment?
Yes, I think it was a great disappointment to the early Christians, because they're like, you told us this was going to happen in our lifetimes. You told us not to get married, not to do whatever, because the Lord was going to come back in his glorified body. We'd be glorified. We're going to run the whole show, and it's not happening.
but it's
In
wishful
the,
thinking.
in the 1990s, our kids went with some neighbors to a Bible school. They came home with a sheet, a timeline
A
of
timeline.
the rapture.
I grew up on time. Anybody grew up on timelines? I
With
did.
little kids.
I had them. Anybody? Any fundies among us? I did.
remember in college.
Did you have any, Sean? No?
I knew people who did,
Yeah, I
and
did.
it was crazy.
I believe every bit of it. And what was the year that it was also come, like 1987 or something?
There's like 16 years.
There were
It's
different
like,
times. And I wait up at night, like, it's going to happen. This is it, because it's on the timeline. Didn't happen.
What is a rapture? I forgot.
Well, modern popular thinking rapture is this, that Jesus is going to secretly come back. We won't see him. And that the true believers, the real faithful, not all of us, because, you know, we're heretic Presbyterian, but the real believers would be, they'll just be, they're gone. They're gone. And they go away to heaven in order to escape what they call the Great Tribulation. Which, if I get my stuff right, 7 years of hell on earth.
The left behind.
But the real believers, yeah, they're left behind. The
Yeah.
real believers go away to escape it. And then those of us who remain, if we really do it right and probably get martyred, we might find acceptance and get saved in the end.
Wasn't
That's the theology.
And the Left Behind stuff, wasn't that Hal Lindsey?
Yeah, Hal Lindsey, there's a whole school of thought, but Hal Lindsey was probably the dean of it all. It's a long, I can't get into all of it, but that's the basic thinking. But it's based on a couple of verses in Paul's letters, one of which talks about the twinkling of an eye. We'll talk about that next week. So we've covered one other thing, and then I'll let you go. These scholars talk about the three worlds of Paul. Paul was a worldly guy in that he was immersed in what's called Second Temple Jerusalem. That's the temple that Jesus knew. That was the religious life at the time that he is a Pharisaic Jew. But he was also very comfortable with Greek culture, Hellenistic culture, and the gods and the myths and all that, the philosophers and all that. He knew all that stuff. He was very, very comfortable in there. But he was also a Roman citizen. And remember that Rome ruled that part of the world. And that Rome had their own religion, and it was an emperor cult. It was the cult of the emperor. Our emperor, our king is God.
He was divine.
He is divine. He is God in the flesh. And that's why Paul was always talking about Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. So those are the weird things going on at the time. It was a cataclysmic time of life. You know.
Isn't that what they charged Jesus with? He said he was king, or he said he was God, and they said, no, Caesar's God.
Well, I don't think Jesus said he was, but other people said he's the Messiah, which translates, Messiah basically means king. It's the anointed. Yeah, only kings are anointed, right? And so people were saying Jesus is the next anointed one. There are others. You guys remember, there were other anointed ones. Jesus was one of many. When he came, oh, he's the anointed, and they're like, you said you're a king? What do you mean you're the king? We're the king. You're not going to run the place. You're not in charge. We are. That was the cataclysm.
But were there thousands of people that were crucified?
Thousands and thousands, yeah, Steve.
Yeah, Jim, before you close, starting Tuesday,
Here comes a commercial.
Morning. This is the commercial. comment before you vote or after you vote for this. And I'm going to be looking at a very provocative letter by Paul, which is called Galatians, and a more loving, happy to be written letter called Philippians.
Yeah.
And we're going to compare and contrast really what he wrote or he dictated and they wrote for him in those letters. So anyway, I'd like any of the men would like to join me 8 o'clock Tuesday morning. And are we going to be in this room here?
In the conference room, I think,
In the conference room?
Unless you have more
It
than
says the read room.
12 or 14.
Do we have to go to the read room?
No, if you fit in the conference room, go
Be in
ahead.
the conference room with the donuts, wherever you smell donuts.
Go for the donuts and the coffee. Good luck finding a parking place, by the way.
Yeah.
It'll be nuts here on Tuesday. By the way, Galatians and Philippians that the men are going to be talking about are considered part of Paul's original early letters. I list the ones that are not. The originals, we think the oldest document in the New Testament is 1 Thessalonians, and then Paul's letter to the Galatians. 1 and 2 Corinthians, we believe, are original. Philemon, Philippians, and Romans. And the ones I love the most are not considered real Pauline. Colossians and Ephesians. Daggone it. 2 Thessalonians we don't think was really Paul's, along with the pastoral epistles, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. All right, that is more than enough for today. I hope I have whet your appetite. I love this stuff. And I do love Paul. I really do. There's parts of him that I just think are magnificent. But I also think he was very strange. And he was a human being, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'll give you all the real gory details next Sunday, so you got to come back, right? Okay. See you then.